Hello, this is the Facing Autonomy podcast here with Zara Richter, that's me. We have Shir, Ali, and Arturo Lazaro here.
Hey.
And we are here to discuss Arturo, along with his writing collaborator, Shedman's most recent piece published on Ill Will Editions. You can find it on Google very easily. It's called The Return of John Brown. White race traitors in the 2020 uprising. And just to give it a small introduction, Arturo has been collaborating with myself and Sheer for several months now, since the spring. And he has continued to put out these amazing pieces. And this piece is thoroughly part of the tradition in which this podcast is operating, which is we're inheriting a tradition of Black Marxism and autonomism from Italy and the thinking of CLR James. And it's important to highlight that this piece is because the culmination of all of that thinking, and because it's gained a lot of influence on the internet already. We're gonna have we're gonna have a conversation with Arturo, asking some questions about it, discussing it deeply, and proceeding to examine its influences, discuss its responses, and think about what new things it adds to a discourse that we've already been cultivating for roughly 2 seasons right now. Spring and summer, we've been working on the same kind of project that is present in this piece.
Yeah, thank you for that really nice introduction, and just every week just having a chance to discuss things. And I think like one thing I want to emphasize about what I think like Ill Will Editions and sort of Arturo are doing is actually, for me at least, one of the hardest things is like actually putting words down onto paper and actually committing yourself to writing about strategy and tactics in relation to the current like uprising and sort of rebellion that's taking place in the country, and more importantly, sort of ensuring that such movements are neither like diluted through co-option and negative tactics of organizing. And I think one theme which is really important within Arturo's work is this notion that we have to build like a new sort of unity, a new humanism, a new sort of way, producing alternative results, I guess you could say, in some ways, alternative sort of forms of organizing, alternative, and utilizing the spontaneity, not as a way to sort of soothe our egos or create divisions, but sort of creating new unity, which is not rooted on sort of, neoliberal tactics of co-option and those sort of things. So I'm really excited about this discussion, and
yeah, I'm excited to talk about it. Have a discussion, because really I've only it's just been me and Shaman, who I've been talking about this with. So yeah, I'm definitely excited to and thankful for the chance to talk to more people about it.
And I think like something very important coming out of the piece is sort of how to look at, develop like a class understanding of what is taking place, and, and what sort of interventions are needed, but also the agency of the Black proletariat, which is traditionally within classical Marxist traditions, sort of underrated, I guess you could say.
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely talking about race, especially a lot, which is different from the way that maybe people that think about class and Marxism, maybe the way we're thinking about it is a little different.
I think that one thing that's really fascinating is in the introduction, you sort of talk about July 25th as Act 3 of the contestation and sort of rebellion that took place following the murder of George Floyd. And within that, you also talk about how, like, the Seattle Chaz protests uh, assumed a certain position in which it, like, sort of prefigured a world where police did not exist. And, you know, and you sort of categorize that as like Act Two, following the murder of Rayshard Brooks. Uh, so just sort of a little bit about how you sort of look at the string of events stemming from the George Floyd rebellion and the questions that were emerging out of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think Seattle Chaz tried to, we say that they tried or attempted, but I mean, I don't think that it was actually achieved. But yeah, I mean, the whole, like you were mentioning before, these texts that we've been writing, like the other one that we wrote, the theses on the George Floyd rebellion, they're really written like in the moment and trying to make sense of what's happening for the purposes of revolutionary strategy
Mm-hmm.
and revolutionary strategy in the United States and the specific conditions and circumstances
Mm-hmm.
that the United States faces, and that it's always faced throughout its history. And so race is a big part of this, that I think is not always translatable to other countries in the same kind of way.
And on
Yeah.
that point, the race politics of different parts of the United States are very distinct from one another.
True. Yeah.
And I think you hear on the internet a lot that the Pacific Northwest is an area of the country which has a greater white population than some places that you've listed, such as Atlanta or Los Angeles, or even Philadelphia or Brooklyn. So
Mhm.
does the immense kind of European American presence in the Pacific Northwest, did that have anything to do with your motivation to write this piece? Because of the emergence in that kind of region, and the specific way in which that region was kind of colonized historically.
I mean, it's not based on that specific region of the United States. I mean, both Shaman and I are coming from a Northeast context, but it's definitely, the way we're writing the text and the reason that we're focusing on the white proletariat, or like poor and working class white people specifically, is because this cycle of riots and rebellions, a main dynamic within them that is different from the past is that there's considerable numbers of white people that are participating, and not just white people, all kinds of people, but white people as well. And that's something that's very different, even from, like, not even just from the 1960s, but even from like the 1990s during the LA riots, which for in a lot of ways de-evolved into race riots between different races of people. So what we're seeing now in the United States is a qualitative leap in terms of the form of class struggle, and so that's really the motivating thing, or the main question we're trying to grapple with, and this kind of like multiracial nature to the riots, and the use of riot tactics, or more like insurrectionary tactics. But I mean, it's happened in all the rebellions. Like, it's not just black people that are fighting the cops and looting stores and setting things on fire. Even if black people are playing a kind of like vanguard role in that process,
Mm-hmm.
it's not the case. It's very different. So yeah, it's like what's happened here is very different. So this essay and other things that we're writing too are trying to make sense of the moment in this
Yeah,
moment.
and there's sort of a historical sort of debate that's always been there surrounding the role of the white proletariat, one could say, and uh, how has it been sort of treated when we look at the 60s or before that in the context of class struggle in the US or larger like insurrectionary or revolutionary sort of mobilizations or rebellions?
You also have a situation where you have black people and people of color who are part of the state, who are part of capitalism in these places where these riots happen, where these rebellions happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just a white ruling class exclusively. And then the people that rebelled and rioted are not exclusively black
Mm-hmm.
in the same way. I mean, that's something that's controversial in the piece where we're criticizing this idea of POC unity, and we make a point that if you look at American history, especially in the Civil War, but also in the 1930s and in the Civil Rights Movement, that white working class people have been a part of struggles that were for black liberation in a way that other racialized formations within the working class haven't necessarily. Um, but then obviously we haven't talked about it yet, but another aspect, and the thing is that got criticized a lot, but we're also talking about the wages of whiteness and the role that whiteness as a social reality and in terms of how the working class has been formed is the glue that holds capitalism together in the United States, and therefore it's something that needs to be overthrown and attacked.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the other side of it.
If I may, do you think that the dominant political structures in this country were expecting white people to be rioting during these protests, or do you think the assumption is that white working class people have not been anti-racist, or do you think that the system knows about their kind of radical heritage, the radical heritage of the kind of white working class, and do you, think that it was kind of suppressing their deep and anti-racist possibilities or potential?
It can be both. I think whiteness is part of a ruling class strategy in American history. And it is this cross-class alliance between the white working class and then the bourgeoisie that is overwhelmingly white, and the ruling class and the state that protects that. And it's also, but it's a contradictory consciousness where white workers obviously don't have a stake in the system of whiteness in the same way that a wealthy, rich white person does. So the white worker is always caught up in this, in a way, a civil war between siding with capitalism and the racial order and the whole American state, and then the rest of the working class and the proletariat. So I think that tension has always existed in the United States as a nation state project, and in one way it's manipulated by the ruling classes, but also in another way it is kind of in the interests of white workers. It's a strategy that white workers have engaged in. So that's why I kind of disagree with Ted Allen. Ted Allen wrote this book, The Invention of Whiteness, and it kind of makes it seem like whiteness is purely just the invention of a early colonial capitalist elite. But I think something that Noel Ignatieff is like describing in his book, How the Irish Became White, is how white workers themselves engaged in this project of whiteness as a way to get a leg up within the working class, and build this system of white skin privileges that gives them preferential treatment compared to the rest of the working class based on their whiteness, or their perceived whiteness. Because obviously, when we're talking about whiteness, we're not talking about a actual real thing. We're talking about an ontology, like it's something that's like reified based on the institutions that reproduce the racial order, like the police and the prison system, and the way that the labor market is organized and made into a hierarchy along the lines of race, the way the housing market, the same thing happens with gentrification. That's where we're coming from, if that makes sense.
So we're starting to bleed into our first kind of topic on that we were wanted to discuss, which was your influences. And
Mm-hmm.
before the show, I had already discussed whether you say that you're influenced by whiteness studies or not. And for those who don't know, those who don't have the academic knowledge that some of us here do have, whiteness studies was a branch of critical race theory that was very popular in the 1990s, and that has now come under a certain amount of critique from the radical end of the Black community, in part for recentering white people in critical race theory discussions. That's been one dimension of the Afro-pessimist kind of critique of whiteness studies. But what I'm seeing from Arturo and Shemin in this piece is not a picture of whiteness studies, which is necessarily offering some kind of workshop as a palliative to the problems of whiteness, but seeing whiteness as being able to be abolished in a material kind of way. But Arturo, I think you said before this show that you don't think that what you're doing has anything to do with whiteness studies at all, right?
No, because I mean, that whole people like Ted Allen and Du Bois and Ignatieff, um, being associated with whiteness studies is almost kind of like after the fact, like that. I mean, even with like critical race theory, I mean, these kind of like specialized disciplines within academia that we can use to describe these things. But really, what they were doing was just like philosophy and history, and it was like interdisciplinary. Um, and it's in a lot of ways, I think, can't be encapsulated by any of these academic disciplines. But yeah, also, in general, I am specifically opposed to the idea of whiteness studies. I don't think it should exist. Personally, I don't think it should be allowed. I mean, I think we should have a critical engagement, and understand that whiteness is a product of history and certain social relations, and that it should be abolished. It should be overthrown through a revolutionary process. But yeah, where we're coming from is definitely not that, because I've seen a lot of stuff that falls under what people call whiteness studies, and I don't think it really has anything to do with the kind of thing that we're interested in, which is a revolutionary strategy for the United States.
And that makes sense
Yeah,
to me, because Peggy
yeah.
McIntosh's kind of solution, if you read, unpacking the knapsack, she doesn't suggest any kind of revolutionary change as a way of dealing with whiteness. She suggests like internal individual self-reflection as a method of dealing with whiteness, right?
Right.
And that's very different from what you're calling attention to in this piece, and in all of your other work and discussions we've had with you. You haven't been ever someone who is just telling people to sit on the sidelines and just think about things, or you're not someone who is advocating for what you see where I live, which is Washington D.C., which is a lot of these kind of workshops that people give, which are like anti-racist trainings, where the kind of the byproduct of whiteness studies, where people, in nonprofits will do these trainings for other nonprofits or for corporations. These trainings are meant, in corporate America to offer diversity training to some degree and to teach, white people with power how to not, use their whiteness in violent ways. And what is your response to those trainings, Arturo?
I mean, it would be the same as anybody that is a revolutionary, or who thinks that we need a revolution in order to actually transform social relations to the point that we don't live in a racist, patriarchal, capitalist society anymore. Which is basically that these are institutions that are going to have to be overthrown and transformed through mass struggle. And that for the majority of people, that those avenues of education and learning about society are not available. And it's going to happen through the ways that, and not even only that they are like less available, but also they're not effective. Like what we've seen from this summer is that riots, arson, looting, fighting the police, this is done more than has happened in decades in terms of changing society. Even from the perspective of reform, it's done more to get people to pass legislation, and politicians, wanting to change things, or corporations. But also, more importantly, from the perspective of revolutionary consciousness and transforming the way that people think about what is possible. This is done more to further revolution and change than anything, in terms of like a woke, like anti-racist workshop, or even within academia, within just the standard channels like the activist world, the established left.
So I
People
want
thought
to
that.
ask you about another potential
Mhm,
influence on your writing.
mhm,
For those of us who are in discussions predominantly with Marxists or anarchists, or who are in those kind of zones where the discussions happen either in person or on the internet, many of us are
mhm.
familiar with Maoists specifically, who are thinking a lot about the difference between, say, the first world working class and the third world working class, or they're thinking about, this book which is all over the internet that everyone tells everyone to read, which is by Jay Sakai, and it's called Settlers, right? And it's about
Right.
why like white people are not part of the working class, and that's Maoist discourse. And in our own CLR James Facebook group that we are involved in, we have gotten some people coming in there insisting that the Black Panthers were Maoists, and insisting on Maoism as an influence on critical race discourse. Um, was Maoism an influence on this piece for you, Arturo?
No, neither of us are Maoists, but I can understand why the comparison is made, because we're not thinking of things strictly in terms of some kind of like purely labor strategy.
Yes, I mean this is
But
you're talking about race, and class together, which is something that Maoists have done more than almost any other part of the left, for better or for
Mhm.
worse.
Right.
Whether or not, and it is debated heavily on the left whether that's a good thing about what Maoists do, is for them to talk so much about nationality and ethnicity, and to some extent race.
Mhm.
And I don't see you citing Sakai, or one might
No,
suggest
no.
you're responding to Maoists a little bit in the piece.
If anything, we're trying. This is an attempt to use the Black radical tradition to respond to people like Sakai, and like people that understand race in the way that a lot of Maoists do, and Leninists as well, and other people within the revolutionary left. So I think our text in a lot of ways it's addressed to revolutionaries, leftist militants, especially BIPOC militants who are thinking about race thinking about class, hopefully thinking about gender, and two, I think that's a limitation of our piece. It is mostly race and class, and also it's specifically mostly black and white. But we're hoping to write more about this, but our audience is trying to engage with the people that are thinking through these questions, I think. And it would be the kind of person that would read The Mythology of the White Proletariat by J. Sakai, Settlers, which I've read, and Shaman has read, and we agree with a lot of it, but we also disagree with a lot of it too. And that is not the tradition that we are coming from.
I think that's very clear to anyone reading it. But I can see that you're in conversation with those kind of people.
Well, I think like one thing like I want to get into is well, I have like two streams of thought in my mind right now, but I'll start off with like kind of a critique. Like I think like you know, in the way C.L.R. James sort of situates, the Black proletariat, or in Black Jacobins, or Fanon in terms of national liberation, like in that sense. I think like there's a significant amount of like you try to address the various components of sort of the white proletariat, like stemming from like white racism, and those things, and how they have to be integral to sort of uh, any larger revolutionary movement. Sort of that whole framing, like I'm sort of at the position where I think like spontaneity is kind of a good thing, and I think that what we're seeing in the movement right now are sort of ruptures, like especially within the sort of radical white organizing that's taking place. There are those who are working to build solidarity on the ground, and then there are those who are sort of aligning with sort of the populist, or sort of far right on certain things, and their appreciation, or sort of anti-neoliberal sort of positioning, but without a race component, or sort of like a class reductionist sort of approach to understanding what's taking place on the ground. They see it as, oh, we're dividing the working class, or those things. And I think it still comes back to the historic role, like even within the Rainbow Coalition, there were immense problems with the role of like social democratic or white activists, or things after the Robert F. Kennedy thing, and I think like that whole tension, uh, sort of like how much like what is the role of white people within this sort of the movement, and how should it be conceived, and what would such a decolonial sort of approach require from white comrades, or the white proletariat at large.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't get into it in the piece, but what we're arguing for is multiracial organizations, which I guess we frame as alliances, but it should be people on the ground acting, together at the same time, across all racial lines, all gender lines. And I mean, that's what I've seen. That's what I've seen in this wave of riots and rebellions and uprisings. So I don't understand. So I understand. What I do understand is that in the civil rights movement, there was an issue with white hegemony in certain organizations, like SNCC, for example, and there was this whole shift that happened within SNCC, where it became a more of like a black nationalist organization, and the white people were kicked out. And these were important internal struggles that needed to take place, and they're taking place today in their own ways with all kinds of dynamics. What was happening then, I don't think is the same as what's happening now. I mean, if people want to form autonomous, formations, they should, and I totally support that. But also, what I'm seeing is multiracial organizations that cut across all race lines in terms of the kids that are out there, or the young people that are fighting in the streets. So I think that's the question of organization, how we need to think about it.
Yeah.
Is from that context. And I don't know if it makes sense for me to think of someone that I'm fighting alongside with who is of a different race. We need to be part of different organizations. I understand that it's happening now too. People have organizations along like different race lines.
Yeah.
And I can respect that when it makes sense, but it also doesn't always make sense.
Mm. And you make the assertion that the BLM program is more radical than, say, Bernie Sanders or the DSA sort of mode of organizing or sort of approach in that. And I thought it was sort of interesting, sort of the provocations that you're making in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders was clearly a failure. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it didn't go anywhere. It's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
One tension I see in your argument is that there's kind of an acknowledgement among in your piece, or at least in your past pieces, that with this whole movement over the summer, that there was these events of subsumption of the movement, that there was that first weekend in early June where the stuff really broke out, and that since then we've seen by and large, and despite what's happened around the country, we have seen a reduction in the really destructive potential of the protests since that first weekend in June. To those people who follow a more Afro-pessimist line, who would suggest that the reason we've seen a reduction in struggle is because there was primarily people of color out in that first weekend, and that since then it's been more white people. How do you deal with that question of subsumption and greater white participation in the protests since the summer has dragged on?
I mean, I would just say that the rebellions and the riots are still happening. Obviously not on the level that when it broke out at the end of May with the George Floyd uprising, which was an amazing experience. It happened throughout the entire country. Yeah, I mean, even now, what's happening, the riots that are happening now, it's not being initiated by white people. They're being initiated by black people, and also, what happened in Lancaster was Puerto Rican people. That it wasn't white people that started that, but there was white people involved in the rioting that ensued that night, which was a Sunday.
So are you then suggesting that the white people that you're talking about in this piece are accepting on an organic level black leadership, that there's still black leadership pervading over these actions?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you think about leadership. I mean, if you mean by that the people that who is initiating, and then the people that are then following and supporting those tactics, black people are initiating. So in that sense, or what happened in Lancaster, which was interesting, was Puerto Ricans, and then white people and black people joining in. You can say that the black and the brown proletariat is engaging this kind of like vanguard role. If you want to think about it in terms of leadership. But I think what we're looking at is just trying to think about what's happening, because it's not leadership in the sense of like formal organization or anything like that.
So back to this question of we've started to touch it on it of white allyship. What does that look like? White allyship is again a concept that was somewhat derived from whiteness studies. But right now, in places like Washington D.C., you see these organizations like I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called Stand Up for Racial Justice, Surge, and there's these organizations that are influenced by whiteness studies, which are saying that white people need to organize among themselves to be anti-racist. But their idea of that is not to become, Marxist revolutionaries or anarchist revolutionaries for that matter. But their idea of that is to, start a nonprofit and have like reading discussion groups about our white privilege and read, Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. Uh, it seems like your idea of the white, of the white working class is not one in which everyone just goes out and joins, some like white-led anti-racist nonprofit like Surge, right?
Yeah, and it's not about staying in these white ally formations or what like specifically white groups. I don't think any of that kind of framework makes sense for the moment that we're in and what's actually happening. In the situations that I'm in, there aren't like white people on one side and brown people and black people on another side. So if we're going to tell these people that they should separate and break apart into separate groups, it has like no bearing on reality. I mean, maybe if you're in a more like upper class context, maybe it's all white people or something, and so people want to organize themselves in that kind of way. But from the perspective of poor and working class people, I don't think that framework makes any sense. And yeah, obviously, it's not about being an ally. It's about class war. It's about wanting revolution. It's about fighting against the state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
We're trying to get at what separates your piece from other ideas of what white people do for anti-racism, and I think that a lot of what you hear or you've heard for a while is people talking about the necessity of like being part of these, following leadership, and they don't mean that as far as following role models like you said or following, someone's example, but they mean leadership as far as like, listening to some leader, a self-appointed leader of the black community who is saying, the specific acceptable ways of being politically involved and just doing that. Today you see some of that being, you get people who are kind of left liberals telling us that, Angela Davis says vote Biden, and that's what we all need to do as white allies is listen to the black Marxist woman, about, and that should be the simple answer. And I think that it's very clear that your contribution here is not, it isn't accepting a kind of organizational idea of leadership, of black leadership. If you have any concept of black leadership in this piece at all, it's definitely a much more anarchistic notion of black leadership. The leadership of the black proletariat who are on the ground, just, acting on their own accord. That leadership be followed by white proletarians who are on the ground acting of their own accord. So this is a much more kind of anarchist or autonomist, notion of white anti-racism, which is much more spontaneous, right?
Yeah. I mean, you have multiracial crowds, and what I've seen happen several times since the end of May is that specifically black, like young black people, that it seemed like they or come from like working class backgrounds, and these are the people that are initiating the riot tactics, and then the other people that are there join in. Not everybody, even at, what you have a crowd of like 1,000 people, maybe only, a few hundred of them are actually, sporadically engaging in these tactics.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not split along race lines, the people who are engaging in the riot tactics. It's completely multiracial. But by the point that, other people start joining in, literally fighting the cops side by side, de-arresting each other, helping each other in the streets, like fighting side by side, getting arrested together. hiding together, running away together, like with people that you don't even know, but you're just the people that are willing to engage in those tactics.
Mm-hmm.
And this is helping to figure out your argument as far as, for listeners and readers, one might read your piece and think that you're oriented toward kind of white separatist anti-racism, but you're not saying that. It seems like you're definitely closer to a universalist notion of Marxist organization, which is that the proletariat as a whole unites, irrespective of past markings and differences, to act for revolution is what you're saying here. You're not saying, you're definitely between the 2 points of separatism and universalism, but you seem like you're much closer to a notion of proletarian as a universal situation that many people of many different locations are falling into and organizing around, right?
Definitely, yeah. We're both. I think we are both universal. I mean, but the thing is, we come at the universal from a critical standpoint that obviously understands things like gender and race, and nationality and sexuality, but yeah, the goal is universal struggle. It's a universal project. But at the same time, the universal often fails. It's not an a priori reality.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's in these moments, of the intensification of the class struggle. It's within the process of revolution that the actual universal project emerges. Is the project of the proletariat, which is to essentially dissolve society and completely transform society and dissolve itself in the process. But it has to
Should
go
we
through
wrap
the
it up?
process of race. I mean, if you study Fanon, you'll get this. He's a universal. It might not seem that way, but Fanon is a universalist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's interesting how this analysis, it faces off with, you have sectors of the left that still don't necessarily like the left communist ideas that we put in one of our previous podcasts. Sections of the left, definitely many left communists, those saying organizations like Platypus, that they don't think that, they don't include black autonomists, or they wouldn't be reading someone like Russell Shoatz, because they see everything is coming down to, for someone like Bordiga to forming, this party, this universal party form that can assimilate the problems of class. It doesn't need to speak to these specific issues. Doesn't need to almost go through the process of race in many cases. And I think that we have criticisms of people like Adolf Reed, who is admittedly he's a black a black person, but he's also a Marxist, and he's also a Marxist that doesn't speak the way Russell Shoatz does about the decolonial project as fighting kind of the state, or fighting the basis of nation. But instead, people like Adolf Reed are more concentrated on on universal categories of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, and avoiding these discussions of intra-racial kind of interactions within the classes, right?
Well, and insurrectionary like alliances that happen in the moment, that cross these racial boundaries, that are not based on the fucking DSA and academia and shit, like
Mm-hmm.
the way that Adolf Reed thinks about transcending race. Like, the way you transcend race is by fighting the cops and engaging in insurrection. So that's where Adolf Reed loses me, is the whole like,
Yeah.
okay, we can go beyond race, but then it's through the DSA and through like reforming capitalism and building like a social democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And it just ends up being this like colorblind liberal bullshit.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
Even though I have respect for him, like I think he's a very smart person, and you can learn a lot from him, but his strategic conclusions are reformist.
And this is a very potent response. I think once we understand what you're saying in terms of all of these other figures on the left, right now, and probably other pieces there you're going to see in the Ill Will edition. They don't conceive of necessarily white anti-racism as going along insurrectionary lines, and certainly I think you're right. What you said earlier in the podcast, that Whiteness Studies did not conceive of fighting whiteness as becoming an insurrectionary or a revolutionary in the street. They conceived of it as a process that was not that material, right?
Yeah. It has nothing to do with a revolutionary strategy at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's like self-help, strategy.
That
or something.
That's a good term for it, like anti-racist self-help, as if that's going to do it for people.
And I feel like even the reading of like like for example, Cedric Robinson, right? A lot of DSA people or social democratic people read Cedric Robinson, but it's in a very different sort of manner that they sort of read these scholars. And I think that, understanding that, but also it's just generally worrying. You see it around the Democratic Party campaign and all these other tactics that they're using. They're trying to, on one level, drown out the voices from the grassroots or on the streets. That's why I personally think that your work has been provides like a fresh breath of air in that sense, like that we should stay true to what the streets tell us in that sense and what people are on the ground are doing.
As much as these riots are continuing in certain places and in certain ways, which I think is great, we are seeing a moment where the protests are dying down overall, across the country. We are seeing a moment where the George Floyd uprising is becoming more finished than it was, say, back in July, right? And what we're seeing right now in our current political moment of the end of September 2020 is the rise of a lot of focus by most discussions on electoral politics, whether it's liberals mourning how Ruth Bader Ginsburg died last night, or liberals making the discussions center on these presidential candidates, neither of which can possibly speak to any of the complexity of our struggles. We're seeing a moment where the focus on police violence is petering out. And so I guess one critique I might entertain is the question of the importance of this making this point at this particular moment. It is questionable in certain ways, given that the movement is kind of dying down, and I don't know that white people are going to be the ones to keep this movement going. And I think that there has been a lot of white people who have done things that have been completely disingenuous and unhelpful to the struggle. A lot of white people have, a lot of people passing as white have subsumed it, whether it's by way of just putting hashtag BLM all over their profile and saying vote for Joe Biden, or some other tactic of kind of insincere verbal support without any recognition of the fundamental systems that need to be changed. So I guess that's my way of saying that. I think that you're highlighting that there have been a couple of white people who have turned away from the liberal subsumption curve, but that overwhelmingly, what you're seeing is not people turning away from the liberal subsumption curve of BLM, but instead you're seeing a lot of liberals getting highly involved, in subsuming, the George Floyd uprising, and highly involved in reducing its power and reducing its riotousness, and that's very sad.
Yeah. First, so okay, there's a lot of things. It's from the perspective of revolutionary strategy, how to prevent subsumption and co-optation of the revolutionary struggle, specifically by white people. I would argue that what we're proposing is the way to do that, which is for white people to become race traitors and join in on the insurrectionary struggle of the black and brown proletariat, and to become part of that and participate in that, and be willing to battle against the police state and capitalist property, and that if we want to think about the process of subsumption, we also cannot forget the role that a section of black people played in the counterinsurgency process. And this is something that Shaman's written about, the rise of the black counterinsurgency. It was also published by Ill Will. But what's happening here in the repression of the revolutionary struggle, it cannot be simply separated along black and white racial lines. So
I think that just in the current context and the way everything is being discussed, I think that this presents like more of an optimistic view of what is possible.
I mean, I was just trying to offer some nuanced critique. I do think that this argument does put, Arturo and Chemin, in a counter position to Afro-pessimism as a theoretical base in the Black radical left right now. So I think that that's one way in which Shear's comment about optimism is relevant. Is that yes, this is a very optimistic take on a struggle that isn't complete, on a struggle that could wind up not having an effect on anything in certain ways, but I do think that Arturo's comment about of course, the bourgeoisie of all different ethnicities and national alignments being involved in subsuming the protest, that is right on the money for me. But I do think that we have to exert some caution because some of the black leadership that I think of myself as following, such as some academics that are enormously pessimistic about racism, such as academics that I was exposed to in the debate community who are Afro pessimists, like Jared Sexton and Frank Wilderson, who are both they're not principally Marxists, but they come from a tradition which engages with Marxism, and they're not talking about racism. They use the word anti-blackness, and I think that those kind of intellectuals would have a very lengthy critique of Arturo's kind of argument, and it's partly because it's too optimistic about what they would call, say, the junior partners of of Western social democracy, and their involvement. They would be very skeptical about these junior partners, and that those folks are definitely skeptical of how anytime black people and white people are working together, that you get white people controlling the narrative, controlling what is done, controlling all of that, and I think that there's some merits to Afro-pessimism, or else it wouldn't be so prevalent in the academy, despite it being only a couple of professors in the University of California's who are the chief propagators of the ideas, So I guess that is another place where I have some reservations about Arturo's argument, is that there is some black leadership that this is flagrantly, not listening to. It's listening to the leadership of black proletarians who are a mix of optimistic and pessimistic. That's what this piece is listening to. It's not listening to pessimistic black leftists who are coming from the academy, who have some really strong arguments about how the white working class has often led to anti-blackness. So
I mean, I think we both, Shaman and I are both influenced by Afro-pessimism, and Frank Wilderson, Sexton, all these people. So to me, what we're arguing is not in opposition to Afro-pessimism, especially for this argument for insurrection against the established society and the complete overthrow of the racial order. Which is in the United States especially, but on a global level too, anti-black, and specifically centered on the black proletariat. or like working class, poor Black people.
Yeah.
Fred, I do think that your citation of Sylvia Winter is a sign that you're in dialogue with those people as well. So
Right.
obviously I don't think you're completely negating Afro pessimism because you're obviously influenced by one of the founders of it. Sylvia Winter is arguably a founder of Afro pessimism, or at least which is this tendency, which is a combination of autonomism and the Black radical tradition to some degree, but our autonomism and CLR James, and so I think that we've been careful to really appreciate the ways in which Arturo's article it comes from this tradition that we're part of, but also I think we've done a good job of saying, well, just because we agree on Arturo and all these Arturo and all these other things, that that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical of what there might be to criticize. So I think we've struck a good balance, and we've thrown a lot of different topics at the wall about related to this piece. So I think this has been a really good, lengthy conversation, and
Yeah, thanks for the discussion.
thank you so much. This has been a good conversation.
Yeah.
We've just gotten a lot out there, and I hope that people hear this conversation and they get to think about Arturo's piece even deeper. And I hope that critics of Arturo's piece hear this. I hope they're listening. So have a good night, both of you.
All right. Thanks.
Okay.